what I'd like to do is just welcome everybody to our second ever Zoom meeting for the ARCI. And I'd like to thank everyone that's here for participating, and thank everybody that was around last time that participated and got the ball rolling. And I think the feedback was very positive. I think that the key to this is just having people to present. So I'll throw the request out right now that says, hey, if you can put together a presentation, email us, and that will be scheduled for the next meeting that we have. We're planning on doing this once a month. I'll just quickly say we've got 5 presentations today, and then at the end, we'll do an open session, and then we plan to close up at 11:30. You know, the email address, if you want to suggest an idea for a presentation or you have some feedback, is this at remoteevents@antiqueradios.org. This is the email that when you send to it, you go to the Zoom team, which is the 4 of us, and that have organized this. So we'll get that and we'll address your email quickly. The protocol for this meeting is we got 10 minutes for each presentation. I'll set a timer so that we can keep things moving along. And that 10 minutes should include questions, and you're the presenter. You can decide if you want questions on the fly, or you can ask to be held until the end. And I'll keep time, and please stay on mute. And, you know, just to keep the traffic down. So what we'll do next is Matt will take over and do a quick introduction on how to navigate Zoom, and then we'll go and we'll immediately go into Matt's presentation.
Wait, when you're on Zoom, you control the view on your end, and that doesn't control the view for everybody else. That's just controlling the view for you. So that's the first thing. The main Zoom controls, and if you're on a Windows machine, they pop up when you move your mouse on the Zoom, on the window that, on the screen that you have that's showing the Zoom stuff. You'll get this menu bar that I'm showing. And on the far left is mute and unmute. And you should use that like a push to talk button. We should all stay muted unless you actually have something to say. The next button over is for stopping your video and starting your video. And if you have more than one camera, that's where you pick your camera. If somebody has a second camera, for example, and they want to wave it around the room to see all the radios behind them, that's where you would control that from. If you move on over on the menu bar, the next item is chat, and that's where you can send a message either to everyone or to a specific person. There's another feature up there which we used just a few minutes ago where you can actually send a file. So Matt Endicott, for example, prepared a PowerPoint that he's going to go over today, and he sent that file to everyone in the chat window. That would actually be a good idea for our presenters to do today. It'd make it real easy. Then we don't have to email files back and forth to send their presentations that way. The next button over is share screen, and that's where you share your screen. When you click on it, it will pull up a window that will give you choices of what you want to share. The first row of the stuff that you want to share are physical monitors. So I have 3 monitors right now. And if I hit share screen, my first row is going to show screen 1, screen 2, screen 3. And then beneath that, it shows windows. Every application that you have running pops up as a window. And Zoom behaves a little differently if you share a window than if you share a screen. If you share a window, it only shows that application. If you share a screen, it shows whatever is on that screen. So it's easier to share a screen, but sometimes you can do fancier stuff with sharing a window. The last thing I want to show is Right now I'm sharing a screen, so you're going to see my selection here. This is an example of gallery view in Zoom. And in the upper right-hand corner, you have a switch between gallery view and toggle view. Gallery view will show up to 49 pictures if your computer can handle it.
Communicating to all these people.
And speaker view will automatically flip to whoever's talking. So right now, if you're looking at speaker view, it's probably showing me because I'm the one who's chattering on. That is a toggle. It doesn't, it shows you the next one to go to, not the one you're on. And the only last thing I would add here is if you have a camera, please turn it on. It kind of feels more like a real meeting. We can see each other.
Okay, so thank you, Matt, for that. And we'll next go into the presentations. The first one, Matt Endicott has prepared a PowerPoint, and I'll remind everyone that we are recording this video. So, those of you in the witness protection program, you may want to opt out of this. But I'll start the timer as soon as you're ready to go, Matt. So why don't you share your screen and let's proceed.
This is American Electric made a number of radio accessories in the late 20s. Starting around 1922, they made headsets. And then they went into speakers and B eliminators. Their code, their cable address was microphone, which you might find interesting for collectors here. That was like a URL sort of in the old days of telegraphs. It shortened the process and made it quicker to send a telegraph. So Peter Burns is the guy. He's the guy that created all these companies. He created American Electric. He started in Kokomo. The company was founded in 1893. And he was from Fond du Lac. He had a number of other companies, including the Laclede Carbonate Electric. He made batteries. He invented a microphone battery. It was one of his first things, and he sold that and took the money and invented more batteries, and then had several glass companies. The Laclede battery was one of his first, and you can see the details there. There is a gentleman, WB9K, has one that powers his desk clock. He's got it working, so it's kind of interesting. You might be able to Google it and find it. But a lot of people don't know, but a lot of these batteries were private labeled. So a lot of times you'll find other people's names embedded in the glass and also on the top cover. The glass was predominantly made, from everything I can tell, in Peru, Indiana, Kokomo, Indiana, and over in Findlay, Ohio. Those were all areas that were in the gas belt. So there was, at the time, there was thought to be an unlimited supply of gas, and that's why the glass companies all located to central Indiana. So anyway, I'll get started on the reason that Burns was the founder of the independent telephone movement. So this screen basically tells it, to help the people, the state of Indiana passed a law in 1885 that fixed the telephone rates. Bell sued that it was unconstitutional. They lost and packed up all their equipment and left. So the people of Indiana for 4 years had zero service for phones. Bell owned all the patents, so it was impossible for anybody to compete. But that planted the seeds for resentment, which led to the formation of the independent telephone movement, of which Peter Burns was the leader. Peter Burns had the battery plant in Kokomo, and he, in 1893, decided that he was going to make telephones again. He'd done this once before in St. Louis and promptly was shut down for patent infringement. But in 1893, he did it again because the patents were set to expire for Bell in I think it was late 1893 actually. But anyway, as that progressed, he sent out a flyer. One landed at a pharmacist, Eugene Brown, in Noblesville, Indiana. And Brown had already hated Bell. So anyway, it formed the meeting where the two met, and they put together a deal, and Burns made the phones, and Brown set up the company for Noblesville that handled the switchboards and the whole service. In the first year, they cleared 30% on their investment at $10,000, had 75 phones installed, and it cut Bell rates by half. So it was a major improvement over what they had had before. American Electric operated in Kokomo until 1897, when Burns then moved the company to Chicago. S.W. Moon and Eugene Brown both joined Burns for the move to Chicago. The company grew rapidly, and by 1903 had 2 locations on Canal Street and another on West Jackson. You know, I can't see my timer, so I'm probably going to get into trouble. They were bursting at the seams. In 1905, well, they had 847 people working there in 1903. In fact, in the very early days of the independent phone system, Burns probably had 65% of the market share. But by 1905, they were down to 390 employees. But Burns went ahead and built a new factory. He bought 12 acres around 64th to 66th Street on State Street around in the Inglewood area. He only used about 2 acres of that, by the way. But the competition continued, and by 1908, the company was down to 124 employees. S.W. Moon, who was also from Kokomo, by the way, left in 1903 to begin his work with Swedish American. And Brown had already been lured to Stromberg Carlson. Inventor Henry Clausen began his career with Burns about 1900. Clausen worked for American Electric, Stromberg Carlson, Western Electric, and in the early 40s with Gray Manufacturing, the company that makes the tone arms and transcription turntables. Burns had a problem, though. He had sold debenture bonds to finance his factory. When sales fell, he wasn't able to meet the interest payments or was unwilling. I'm not sure which, but at any rate, a debenture holder sued him and he lost. So fearing that others would do the same, he voluntarily declared bankruptcy. The sole creditor was P.C. Burns. So he had none of his suppliers were affected whatsoever. And the stockholders were all closely held, friends of his basically. But the debenture holders had no collateral basis. So when he filed bankruptcy, that ended his problem, and they were left holding the bag. Brown rejoined Burns in 1912 as sales engineer, and the next thing that came out of Burns was hand horns. These are rotating, completely mechanical, acoustical horns. Kind of interesting. They made a
Matt, you got about 3 minutes. 3 minutes left, Matt.
I got about 3 minutes. Okay, he made a number of different horns. I'll demonstrate one in a minute. He made motorized. They were hand crank, plungers, you name it. Okay, I'll get back to the radio portion of Burns. Well, so we're moving up to 1922. That's when he started with the headsets. In 1924, he came out with the 205B, and then the concert series came out in 26. I think most of you guys have seen these. These were available in Shell. Actually, they were also available in Mother of Pearl. Mother of Pearl was $30, and from everything I can tell, they only sold them for a few months in 1926. But I could be wrong, but they're rare. That's a picture of my collection. I've got a B eliminator. There's a Pyrolin concert series on the left, the Shell, and then the black one on the right is got the nickel plated. That's a 205B. The other objects there is a Samson battery and a horn. That's a Samson Tiger horn. So there's a couple more pictures. This is Burns' death. Basically, you know, they reported he died from appendicitis, but I think he had something more critical than that. It was seemed to have been a chronic illness. He had plenty of time to prepare for his passing. And there's just a couple pictures of the plant. This was all destroyed and torn down, demolished when they built the interstates that went down through, I think it would be the Dan Ryan and the Stevenson. There's the later one. After the bankruptcy, telephone was removed from the name and it was reorganized as the American Electric Company, less the telephone. And that's where he was located. So you can see he's real close to University of Chicago. Of course, all of this today looks completely different because the interstates have physically divided the neighborhoods. And these are just a couple other items, pictures that you can look at of Burns' thing. I don't have a Burns phone, so I found the nicest examples I could find on the internet, and here they are. But a lot of these phones are worth a substantial amount of money. That's the earliest phone. That's a made in Kokomo phone. Those were quite rare. Most of the early Kokomo phones were either in Noblesville or the next location was Logansport, Indiana. So I'm going to switch, if I can, to back to my video. How do I stop my share? Okay. Sorry, this is, okay, so I'm back on. So since I'm almost done, hopefully you can see me. And let's see, here's a horn. So did you hear that? The horn actually works. It rotates the knob. I don't know if you can see it, but the horn, it rotates either direction. So this horn actually was hanging on the door of a Model T. It's from 1915. It hasn't had a thing done to it. You can see it's pretty rusty, but it still functions quite well. And anyway, it was an interesting thing. I had no idea that Burns made all this stuff. So that's why I did the presentation.
Well,
anyway, so how's that?
That's almost perfect for time, Matt. That was about.
Well, I had to speed it up.
Yeah, well, that's good. It's 10.5 minutes, and that's pretty impressive collection that you have of those Pyrolite speakers and or Pyrolin speakers, and the history is a pretty good history lesson, and I'm glad you put the PowerPoint out there so I could read that in more detail.
Yeah, I think Burns has been completely forgotten. He just kind of disappeared from history, and it's not many people know much about him. So it, you know, I think if Alan Douglas had lived around Chicago, we would have had more Chicago history in his book, but he didn't. So anyway, it's always new things out there. So.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Matt. Let's just, if there are any questions for Matt while it's fresh in your mind, let's just use a minute to ask a question if you have any out there.
This is Charlie Wright. I liked the presentation, and I actually have a couple of these batteries.
All right.
There's another one over here, and I learned something today, and I don't know if it's exactly the same as yours, but it's very similar.
Yeah, he made a number of different batteries. I'm certainly.
This one doesn't have a name on it.
Okay.
So I don't know, but it looked a lot like that picture.
Yeah, he private labeled a lot of that stuff. So most of them, when you see them on eBay and all, they'll have some company name, but that isn't who made the battery.
Okay.
So I have a question. In the era of private telephone companies, were they interconnected? Could you make a call from one private telephone company to another? Do you know?
Well, if the wiring lended itself to, yeah, but it was all based on wire. Of course, the early switchboards were not automatic. That was Stroger's deal and Automatic Electric. Automatic Electric is kind of unusual in the history of the pieces. They were almost bankrupt. All of these independent phone companies, when they first started out, the business took off in great numbers, but they went south about as fast as they'd gone up because they had so much competition among each other. But Automatic Electric, their system, they had an automatic switching system. But the problem that they had was that Bell didn't want it. Bell could care less, and Bell was the big player. Bell said that they didn't want any automatic switching. Their customers wanted to talk to an operator. Well, that worked out fine until 1918, when Bell's telephone operators went out on strike. So Bell suddenly realized they needed automatic switching, and that's when Automatic Electric was given a big boost and continued on and became GTE eventually. But one other thing I learned that was interesting that I had no idea about, which might also play a role in some of the early headsets that were made, but they hired a lot of deaf mutes. Deaf mutes were highly sought after for work on acoustical telephones. And the reason was that deaf mutes, or hearing impaired as we call it today, have a higher sensitivity to touch. And they were able, as assemblers, to assemble a lot of the products. And I think that's how they did the testing, was by feel. So it was kind of interesting. I had no idea, but in 1903, 150 of the deaf mute employees at American Electric went out on strike. They weren't really striking for any reason. They were just striking because the union guy had come down to visit and said, "We need you to support these other people on strike." So they said, "Okay." So in support of the other unions, they went out on strike. But at any rate, it completely shut down Automatic Electric. They had a total of 1,000 people working for them, and they all had to go home. And the cops came down. It was a big brouhaha during the strike. But the point is that I had no idea that deaf mutes had played such a large role in the assembly of these early acoustical devices.
Yeah, that's very fascinating, Matt. That's a really interesting piece of information. So
yeah, it was totally unexpected.
So I'm going to be the moderator here and move us on to the next presentation, but I'd like to thank you again for your fascinating presentation. So
you're welcome.
Our next presenter is Art. And Art, if you could get your desktop camera going and all that, we'll start.
Well, you should. Then I'm going to. So let me start this off by saying, any of you people with large collections, if you're thinking of moving, don't. Before we made the decision to move, I had approximately 400 radios in the house, plus tons of parts. And in a period of less than 6 months, I downsized that by 2/3. So this is what I have left. Everyone was individually boxed before the move. And I know you're doing a little bit here, but so in my office, and I'll show you out the hall first, I have my obligatory Zenith console, the 267 or 265, and then let's see if I can do this without the glare. RCA, it's canvas printed and framed. So those two things were easy to move because the movers move those. But a lot of the smalls in here, I individually packed. So an original Zenith neon, and that took in fact, I lost one neon in the move. Then there is some Zenith advertising glass, a dealer sign in small. And then there's my 260, that one is 267 or 265. I don't remember which, I always confuse them. I think that's the 67. That's been refinished about 15 years ago. Chair side, and this was the only thing, this is the 7-tube Zephyr, and this was the only thing I lost a tube on. The chassis on this sits upside down, and so one tube fell out. I have about 10,000 tubes, and guess which one broke? The one I don't have. It was a ballast tube. There's my, and I'm going to get over here so I don't get as much glare. My obligatory Walton, a 7-tuber. No, 9-tube, I'm sorry. Then my leg lamp. You know, it just fits, and it sits at my window, and in my neighborhood, I'm known as the leg lamp house. By the way, there's also the BB gun that goes with it.
It's a major prize.
It really is. It's very fragile. Oh, wait a minute, there's the camera. Okay. Underneath here is a bunch of Fillmore stuff, a couple of just common Bakelites, and then just some smalls. From here we move to spring carbon microphone, and let's see, does this work this way? No, it doesn't. Okay. There's my Philco grandfather clock. I have the original face in the garage I picked up, and I just haven't had time to put it. So, any questions on the radios you've seen so far? So I can spend some time on that if you have a question. Okay, good. So each of these was packed in an individual box. The obligatory chromed metal radio, Pollack Catalan, the other one, the Spartan split grill, and then the general, like the GD 520. These were the three colors that were made by Spartan. They were very heavy plastic, and as far as I know, believe it or not, the white one was the hardest one to find in my collection. I started off with the green, then found the red, and then the white one I actually found on eBay. Then we have a Pilot, and the Pilot radio was actually, I also had one at one time that had a Lionel name. So they must have been private labeled. Coronado, Sentinel Catalan, my two Disneys that I have, and my granddaughters actually love those, so it's nice to see that they're interested. Bakelite, the Plascon Estafada, another Catalan, the Duet in white, Satchel Frog Eye, the piano, the upside down chassis Zenith. There's my 829. And I've been afraid to refinish it primarily because that grill cloth is not replaced. This one's in perfect shape and I'm afraid to take it off. So that may be a long-term project. Then the tea kettle, which I think everybody has. From here we go. The blue mirror, and I don't know how well it shows up, is a cord, C-O-R-D. And I have only ever seen two in the existence of radio collecting, and I've been collecting for about 40 years. Chris Gimme had one, and he actually had to borrow a tracing of mine to reproduce the mirror. Nice little TRF Cathedral, Emerson. This, I don't do transistors, but this one always just caught my eye. Little transistor, built-in lamp, and then the radio actually comes off. So you can move it around. Addison, another Frog, another Catalan. Emerson Ingram, I always like this one because of the shape. I'm still looking for the Sterling in blue. It's still kind of hard to find. I haven't seen one for sale in years. My another Catalan, Cloud, my Addison, another Catalan. The book radio, the RCA, was made for export only down to South America. So there's not many that have come up this way. Green Fata, another. As you can tell, I've kept all my Catalans over the years. And then my midgets. Now, I wish those two were real. They are Chris Gimme reproductions. And because the real one, the red one, last one I saw sold for $18,000. So you don't see them often. I'm going to back up a little bit here. Up on top, look what I have, a Burns horn. the only horn I kept. It's the pedal. There is an RCA microphone, 1927, 28. It actually has 199s in it. And the thing weighs a ton. RCA neon. Just an RCA tube box, giant display model. Another neon. The Raytheon is a spinner. In other words, the heat from the bulb makes the thing spin. The Atwater Kent, I just bought at the last Radio Fest, believe it or not. And then there's an RCA dealer display sign, and the tube rotates. How am I doing on time?
You got 2 minutes.
All right. And if we don't finish, we can always come back and do this again. So, little Emerson, RCA, the Trolla. Tom, you should remember that one because I bought it from you. The little Majestic without the decal, without the Charlie McCarthy on it. The Trolla, my Climax Ruby, the Junior. Little Firestone, General, another Catalin, Mantola, I think. Yeah, Mantola, Bendix, Gerard, Catalin. This one I always like. This one used to sit on my desk. It's a desk set with a pen and a clock and an inkwell. I don't know much history about it. Every now and then you see parts of it because the two ends actually unbolt. So sometimes you find the radio, but not the pen and clock. Let me scoot down here. My Silvertone, another General Television, Silvertone Bullet. Majestic one, I think it's a 134 if I remember the model number. What makes this unique, and I would pull it out if I could, but it's hard to get in there. The side has a giant clock, and it's like an early clock radio. You could have it turn on and off at different times, and it would change stations for you. So if you wanted 890 at 8 a.m., turn it off at 10, turn it back on at noon for 1000 a.m., it would do all of that for you. And then there's my Atwater Kent in 84, completely original. Guess what? I think everybody has had one of these at one time, the Guild Spice Chest. Oh, there's my timer. I've got one shelf left to go. We just won't do the other rooms.
Let's finish it, yeah.
Yeah, there's my two tuna boats. My White Fire Cloud, another Emerson, another Detrola, and go on. There's my Hopalong Cassidy. I've got the black one too. That's in the garage on the to-do pile. My Motorola. This one we've seen, the Majestic, but you don't normally see it in the Beetle. My Jewel clock, kitchen clock radio. The General Television. I always like that one because of the shape of the grill. My Beetle Silvertone, my Dion, Silvertone again. There's my Charlie, a little, I forget, Detrola, Emerson, and another DeWalt. And then finally, just on this wall, these are all original advertising pieces. My Radiotron, my Atwater Kent, these are all magazine cutouts, believe it or not. And then I can't get around. So that's probably it for today without taking a lot of time, because I have a lot of stuff on display in garage, like all my advertising pieces, because I finally had a big garage wall that I could hang a lot of this on.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating to see that at a future presentation.
Yeah, we can do that at another time.
Okay.
So as you can see, I kept mostly smalls. I knew how much room I had in this office before we moved, so I kind of counted that way. And for those of you who had been at my house, you know how much more I had.
Wow. Well, that's quite impressive. I think that's like a museum right there, and it's just on that wall.
I try.
That's cool. Are there any questions for Art before we move on?
Hey, Art,
Yes, Tom.
who made your desk set?
That's an ARCI, AIRITE.
Okay, thanks.
The clock is overwound, and I've been afraid to take it apart.
I
Okay,
have
well,
a question for Art.
go ahead.
Yeah, Art, the carbon, the suspended carbon microphone, is that WLS plate original?
No, actually what happened was, if you remember the video that was done probably 3 or 4 years ago about the barnyard dance on WLS in Chicago, public television, well, they spent the day at my house filming radio. So every radio that you see in that video came from me. And as a result, the club got a financial donation. And what they did is they gave that to me as part of my gift for saying thank you for letting me invade my house for about 12 hours.
That's very cool.
It is. I mean, you can tell up close it's new, but it still adds to the piece.
That's great. Okay, we're moving along pretty well here. So since Gary Bernstein is unable to present today, we could move to Don, or I can queue up mine. But if Don's ready, we could try that.
One of my favorite meters. The reason I like it is because the ohm scale is nice and wide, as opposed to a Simpson 260. I am a devotee of Simpson 260s, but this you have to give the triplet people credit for stretching the ohms out better. That I like. That's a good idea. And then let's see if I can move it over. Oh, wait a minute. Now this is a little tiny general purpose VOM that you can buy, and I like to have one of those in the toolbox. They're so handy to have, and they're cheap. So I keep those in a small toolbox. They don't get beat up as bad. This is an assortment of VOMs that I have. One of the, this guy here is Simpson clone called ANPSM6. Now this is a Simpson, no, I'm sorry. This is a variation of an old model Weston meter done by the military called the TS-352. It's an ugly beast, and carrying that thing up the airlock in an Arctic radar radome is a pain in the neck. But the problem with it was it used pin jacks, and the little pin jack things inside used to deteriorate. So sometimes people have just take them out and hang test leads on it instead. But it does have R times 1K and R times 20K, so that it had various, you vary the sensitivity. That was done so that you could, it could replace older 1,000 ohm per volt VOMs working on radios, or newer 20,000 ohm per volt meters. Okay, now let's see. This one here. Okay, now this is a, if you can see this Simpson, this is the fancy high sensitivity VOM. It's the top of the line as far as Simpson went. Very expensive and kind of delicate because of their 100,000 ohm per volt, I think. And then this is the Simpson 260 that uses expensive batteries. For some reason, they had a little battery clip arrangement that had 2 expensive batteries in there. Kind of dumb. And this one here is a small, oh, this is a low ohm range. The problem with this thing was, in order to make it work properly, you had to use it with a large external battery, because if you use it with the mercury battery that you can't get now, it was a pain. But when they work properly, they're great, because for checking out the transformer windings and so forth, they're you can measure low ohms very well. And let's see here. This thing is a PSM6. I mentioned that. And let's see. Oh, back to this guy again. This is an Arrow multi-tester. It was a low price version available to kind of replace the Simpson 260. And then this here is a PSM 37, which has a lot of fancy things. That it's another meter that uses the same movement as a TS352, but it's got decent jacks on it, and it can measure pulse current, whatever that is, but it's got 2 switches, and it's a very similar. You'd have to consider it an updated version of a Simpson 260, military spec. It's waterproof and all that good stuff. And let's see. I think I've covered it all.
Okay, well, that's just about used up all the time there, Don. So
Yeah, that's about all I've got to offer. I've got another couple of VOMs, but this is my basic collection. Any questions? Oh, this thing, did I explain this? This is Simpson had a whole series of adapters that plugged into late model Simpson 260s. This one here lets you measure AC current, which you couldn't measure on a 260. So if you got this adapter and plugged it in, and while you're using it, you can also use it as a regular meter. It's got banana plugs on the back side that plug into a late model Simpson 260.
we'll move on to Bill, if you're ready, Bill.
Cool. All right. Due to what I talked about at the last meeting on 5-tube All-American 5s, and comment made by Art Bilski about ways of dealing with dropping resistors, I put together a very short presentation. It's not going to be very long, and I didn't want it to be terribly technical, because actually it can get very, very, very complicated. So why you cannot use a curtain burner line cord today. Why? Yes. So there you go. There's a curtain burner line cord in a box. You'll notice they're generally cloth covered cables. They will have at least 3 wires coming out of them. This particular one has more than that, because there was probably a tap in there for a pilot light, although most of them didn't do that. Most of them were just 3 wires. So you had the AC line coming through and the resistance cord. So let's move on here. So what was the problem? So we would have several tubes in series, typically, in this case it was 4, but typically 5, with some sort of resistor to make up the difference in the voltage drop across the filaments. Now, the filaments are all the same current, and before the modern tubes that added up to 115 volts or 120 volts, these tubes typically added up to about 68, 69 volts. So that meant you had to drop about 60 volts someplace. And that was dropped typically 2 ways. Either in the line cord with a very long Nycomb wire resistor, or it was done with a ballast tube. The reason they would do it in the line cord is you distributed the wattage problem, the actual heat that was generated. So you typically had 5 tubes in the table radio, 300 milliamp current, and you needed to drop 60 volts. So that meant at 60 volts, at 300 milliamps, you were dropping 18 watts of power. Think about that. That's like a small electric blanket. If you try to put that all together in one of those small resistors and try to mount that back on your chassis, it'd be an enormous amount of heat in one spot. Typically, most small table radios, and Art had lots of pictures of them, you would end up melting some of that pretty Catlin. It wouldn't be very good. You just really can't do that. You could put an 18-watt resistor in a little box somewhere else. That's one way of doing it. The use of the curtain burner line cord, though, typically took that 18 watts of energy and spread it out over 6 feet. One of the issues that many people did, though, is they would hank the cord together because it might have been too long, and they kind of bunch it together and stick it near something that was combustible. And when you bunched it all together, now all that heat's in one spot. You also had the terrible problem of you're bending the cord. They're not real good at bending, and you can actually break them. And I know Art recently sold a whole bunch of these cords on eBay, or no, I guess it was Facebook Marketplace. Most of them are, or actually all of them, contained asbestos, because that was what they did to part of the insulation that was used inside of them. So basically they were made up with asbestos, rubber wires, cotton, and a lot of things that were just really bad and don't age well. So even if you found a brand new one in a box, chances are it's probably going to be brittle and probably not something you particularly want to use. So what can we do to solve this issue, possibly to make the radio work and not create 18 watts of resistive heat? So one solution, and I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to go into the math because the math is extremely complicated. We're talking about phase angles because we're talking about a capacitive, the capacitive resistance essentially, which is at a different phase angle than the resistance. So there's a lot of interesting math here. I did not invent this. All this is really easily found on the internet. All you have to do is Google resistance line cord and you'll come up with about 12 different articles on how to do this particular thing. You actually have people who have spreadsheets where you can plug the values of the tubes you put in and it'll tell you what capacitor needs to go there. But it's easily done, actually very empirically done, by using something called you can make up your own decade box, essentially. You need to use really high quality capacitors. So if you're trying to drop the voltage for these filaments, you're looking at a capacitor in the range of 1 to 10 microfarads. It cannot be an electrolytic capacitor. It must be a high current AC capacitor. So you're looking at something like a motor start capacitor. The recommendation was made by one of the fellows on the internet was he actually made a bank of several of these, and he would you start at the low end, you start at 1 microfarad and start switching up. You put your voltmeter across one of the 6-volt tubes in the chain and start cranking up the capacity until you're getting approximately 6 volts AC across that tube. And that will then give you the final value. Now, you don't have to be exact because the tubes are pretty fluid. They'll work plus or minus 10% without too much trouble. I don't think it's a real issue. Also, when you do this, of course, your radio now becomes an AC only radio because it will not work on DC anymore. Not that many people are trying to plug it into a DC outlet. But the capacitor itself doesn't really generate much heat in this application because of the way capacitive reactance works. It just doesn't generate heat like a resistor does. So that's a fairly easy way to do this, but you have to find these high quality capacitors to actually put in this place. Generally, I'm thinking the capacitor is going to be in the range of about 6 to 8 microfarads. Will work for the standard 5-tube table radio. I know there are other radios out there that have different tube complements. Some of the cadets may have only had a few tubes. You can also use this capacitor to replace a ballast tube. It will work certainly there as well. There are other techniques, and I'm not going to go into it here, where people have actually put a diode in series with the filaments, which also works, but it gets even more complicated to measure the voltage across the tubes at that point, because now you're not measuring, well, after that nice presentation of the Simpson 260, it's probably the wrong meter to measure the voltage across the tubes, because it won't measure the AC correctly. You really have to measure the voltage across the tubes with a true RMS meter, which a Simpson 260 is not. Most VOMs don't do that. So if you were trying to do something with a diode to try and lower the voltage, I don't particularly recommend it, because diodes have a tendency to short during arcing or problems with your power line. Although I did talk to Matt earlier in the week about this, and he made a perfect suggestion. You can put 2 diodes in series. It gives you some fail safe there. Interesting idea. I think the capacitors are probably the safest way. And I think I talked to Tom Kleinschmidt, who was worried about them shorting. Motor start capacitors don't typically short. They tend to actually kind of just go away after a while. Electrolytics short, but most high quality AC caps generally are pretty reliable capacitors. And I think that's probably the right way to do this. And that's all my spiel on this. Hopefully that got some information out. Any questions?
Hey, Bill, where do you find the AC capacitors?
You actually can find them places like Mouser, and the suggestion was actually Allied Industrial. You know, their industrial division still exists in some place in the world. But you can find those high value capacitors. They're really like big Mylar caps, but they are available.
You can also find motor start capacitors from HVAC supply houses, and
Yes.
I've been told that ceiling fans motors often use, like a 7 microfarad motor start.
Which might be just the one you need.
Yeah.
Granger also has them.
What'd you say, Keith?
Granger.
Yeah, Granger. WW Granger probably would have them. You're absolutely right, Keith. Someplace, an industrial place that deals in motors.
Well, Bill, that was about the perfect length for a presentation. That's 9.5 minutes until now, so
Good.
that's great. So thank you very much for that. If there's no further questions.
Unshare the screen here, don't I?
Yeah. So, Bill, what do I do with that box of diodes I have?
Well, you use them for rectifiers. Just don't use them to drop the filament voltage.
Okay.
Got to replace all those selenium rectifiers you got.
I'm not sure I even have one.
Selenium rectifiers?
Yeah, I don't think I have a radio with one in it.
No, the radios you have are all too old.
Yeah. I have more in the garage, though.
If you got anything from the 50s, any of those AC/DC AM/FM radios, they all had selenium
Yeah,
rectifiers.
don't own a single one.
I put together a presentation about some radios that I have that are it's not obvious that they're radios. And so the first one that I'd like to show you is, it's on the wall back here. You can see my screen. It's this picture up here. Can you see that?
Yeah, it looks good.
Yeah, so this is actually a All-American 5 tube radio, and you can see it in the lower right corner. There's a couple of knobs which stick out like sore thumbs. But there's a radio in here, and the speaker is right behind here. And this is a pretty rigid piece of artwork, but there's sound ports on the top and the bottom. So it actually sounds like a radio. And I've got some slides here that I'll share with you that this is a Kenro Audio Vista tube radio, and they made a few versions of this thing, and I found some on the Radio Museum website, and they made them with plastic frames and wooden frames. The one I have is made out of wood, and you know, my comment is here is this was not an act of marketing genius. It's not a very big thing, and it's pretty ugly, actually. You can see how big that radio is. It's not very big at all. And it was made in 1961 up near Milwaukee in this town of Fredonia, which I've never been to, but I've been to Milwaukee. If you know about melamine plastic dinnerware, Kenro was the company that made these things. And the two founders are the guys there, Kenneth Welch and Roger Zaczek. And they named the company back when they founded it in 1951. And it was a very successful company making dinnerware, but they only made these radios for like 1 or 2 years. And the radio was made in Japan, that much I know. I don't know if they made the frame there as well, but it's a pretty tiny little thing. All I did was replace the power filter caps, and it worked fine. And it's the classic All-American 5 design. They have a very neatly drawn schematic inside of it, and you can see the Japanese brand tube there. I've never seen that brand before, and but that's that radio. Any questions on that radio?
I love that radio. It's always cheap. They didn't put a second IF transformer in it. There's a coil there, but it's not a full transformer.
Oh yeah, you're talking about right there?
That was typical of those Japanese radios from the early 60s.
Yeah, I mean, it's very neatly built and very tiny. But... Okay, so the next radio that fits into this category is also behind me, and that's this Zenith right here in the bookcase. And this radio is one of those upside down Bakelite chassis that ARC showed. ARC had the little version of this in the little tiny tabletop radio, but they use that same chassis in this radio. And we've got a few slides that we can talk about this radio. So the model number of this is the 6D455, and I restored this, I got it working, and it's from 1940. It's the only year they made this chassis because it was pretty much not a good thing to have out in the field because it broke. It's got 6 tubes, one of them's a ballast tube, and it's very, very compact. Again, it ties into Art's presentation because he had one of these radios on his shelf, this chassis. And the Bakelite chassis was just too brittle, and the fact that it was upside down meant that the heat kind of, the chassis was being heated by the tubes being upside down. And so this is a picture of the back of the radio, and you can see that it's upside down, and you can't really see the chassis here, but you can just see the fact that everything's upside down. And now this is the bottom of the chassis, which is the top of the radio, and you're looking down, and it's a very unique chassis. I've never seen anything like this, really. It's this whole bottom is one solid piece of Bakelite, and the tube sockets are really not separate items. They're basically stuck pins into the Bakelite and made a socket out of it. So the idea was this was supposed to speed up manufacturing. So they would snap in these pins, they wouldn't have to install sockets separately. And you can see from the top, they snapped in some of the variable capacitors that needed to be in here. And So there's no separate tube sockets, no separate mounting holes for screws and things like that. So I thought it was a very interesting design. And again, here's the schematic if anybody's interested in seeing that. Any questions on the Zenith?
Go on.
Where is? Oh, here.
Okay, so, all right. So yet another radio here. We go back to here, we can go down here, and then down here on the bottom, a Stuart Warner book radio. And this radio is from the 30s, and you can see that it's pretty compact. And the back shows you the arrangement. It's very tight. Again, this ties into Bill's presentation, in that this is a curtain burner type radio. And I got some slides to talk about this radio. So I'll go back to sharing here. Yeah, the model number of this is an R-108, and each of these books has got the same title, Current Events. And maybe that was a pun intended, I'm not sure. And down here it says Stuart Warner. You can't really read that part, but it's not huge, but it's it could have been bigger, and it would have made their life a lot easier to make this thing. But it was built around 1933. It's broadcast band only. It's a 4-tube tuned radio frequency design, AC or DC. And as I mentioned, it's a curtain burner. I found this thing, it didn't have the cord with it, and I haven't restored it yet. But it also has a plug for battery operation, which is this thing right here. And it's really dense. It's one of the more crazy things I've ever come across. And the volume control shaft actually goes through the speaker cone, which I've never seen that before in radio. And you can see the shaft right there poking through the speaker cone. That was part of the engineering of this thing. And I could just imagine the engineers and the marketing guys getting together and arguing about this thing. But, well, it's got to fit in this book, and the book has got to be this big. And we only got speakers that are this big. And, they had to chop this piece of the speaker off right there. So it's turned into a product, though. And and you can see this is a curtain burner schematic. You can see down here, as Bill showed, this is the resistance of the cord right there. And but also there's a battery plug right here, and it shows how you hook up a B battery and an A battery to run this thing off of 6-volt operation. And from what I could see in some of the research, that they also use this chassis in automobile radios. So I'm not sure how they got the B plus supply with just a 6-volt operation, but maybe you had to bring along a B plus battery. So so that's my presentation on these radios that are just hiding in plain sight.
So, Tom, you were commenting on that operation as a car radio. They did one of two things. Often there was a B battery that was easy to get at. Some of the higher end cars, they had dynamos in them. My dad used to restore a lot of early car radios, and Packard actually would put a motor generator in one of the glove compartments of the car when you got the radio. So you lost the glove compartment, but you gained a B plus power supply.
And how did they get mechanical energy to the motor generator?
Well, being a motor generator, the motor ran on 6 volts and generator put out
Okay.
whatever it did.
It was running off.
Dynamotor, the dynamotor.
A
Very
dynamotor would be a better word, maybe, but motor generator is the function. There's a motor, and I
I
think they're
understand. That's
separate entities, unlike some of these, when you buy some of the stuff where it's using a common field, I think they actually have 2 separate fields. That was a Philco product on those. Packard liked Philco, so a lot of Packard were using Philco.
Yeah, so I found a lot of really good information in these Zenith books that are referenced here. Highly recommend them if you collect Zenith radios. But yeah, these 2 books here I've got. If you ever come across these are really valuable references for the Zenith radios of that era. Any other questions?
Yeah, but you're forgetting the king of all radios that don't look like radios, and that's all the guilds that got built. You know, for a long time, I used to collect those from the, the common telephone one to the hurdy-gurdy, and it's a cute novelty set that was pretty easy to work on. The chassis were pretty common.
Yeah, that Spice Chest radio that you showed us, was that a guild?
Yeah, that's a guild. Yeah, I used to have everyone except the desk, and that was just too damn big.
Well, that's cool. I'm glad my presentation was able to tie into yours about the upside down radio and into Bill's about the converter. So that was kind of interesting. If we don't have any other questions, we'll roll this over into an open session. And we're actually running about 20 minutes past where we wanted to be, but we can keep it open longer if we need to.